I had spent years saving every extra dollar, skipping vacations, avoiding impulse purchases, and pushing my old sedan to its limits just to finally afford that one thing I had always dreamed of. A brand new car that was entirely mine, paid for with my hard-earned money. The moment I signed the paperwork and the dealer handed me the keys, I felt a rush of pure, unfiltered pride in myself. I ran my fingers along the smooth, gleaming hood, inhaling the intoxicating scent of fresh leather seats, and thought, this is mine. Every single part of it is mine. I had barely owned the car for a full day before my younger brother Jason decided that my happiness was his for the taking. Jason, who had been pampered and spoiled his entire life, had never worked for anything, never taken responsibility, and never faced a consequence that our parents couldn't cover up. He was the type of person who treated other people's possessions as if they were his by default, simply because that was how life had always worked for him. When I pulled into our parents' driveway that evening to show them the car, Jason was already there, leaning casually against the garage with that lazy, self-satisfied smirk he always wore. He barely glanced up from his phone as I parked. "Nice ride," he remarked, pushing himself off the wall and sauntering over, peering through the driver's side window as if he had already decided it belonged to him. "What's the mileage?" "Less than 100, I replied, forcing myself to keep my tone neutral, even though I could feel my patience wearing thin. Jason let out a low whistle, nodding appreciatively. Then, without asking, he reached for the handle and pulled the door open. "Let me take it for a spin." I immediately moved to shut the door before he could climb in, shaking my head firmly. "No way. I just got it. You're not driving it." Jason rolled his eyes as if I had just told him he couldn't borrow $1. "Oh, come on, Emily. Don't be such a control freak. It's just a car." "Exactly," I snapped. "It's just a car that I paid for. With my own money. You don't get to take it." But Jason had never been the type to accept no for an answer. He just grinned, shrugged, and backed away. But something about his expression sent a warning chill down my spine, like he already had a backup plan in motion. I should have trusted my instincts. Later that night, I left my car keys on the entryway table for just a few minutes while I went upstairs to grab something from my room. When I returned downstairs, the keys were missing, and so was my car. My hands clenched into fists as the realization hit me. "Jason!" I yelled, rushing outside, my heart racing, but by then he was long gone, tires squealing in the distance. I pulled out my phone and dialed his number, but it went straight to voicemail, again and again. I was still seething when, 2 hours later, my phone finally rang, but it wasn't Jason's number. It was an unknown caller. I answered, already bracing myself. "Miss Anderson?" a deep voice said, calm but serious. "This is Officer Reynolds with the County Police Department. I'm calling about a vehicle registered under your name." My stomach dropped. "What happened?" "There's been an accident." A pause. "The driver is unharmed, but the vehicle sustained significant damage." My grip on the phone tightened. "Who was driving?" The officer hesitated for just a moment before responding. "A young man who identified himself as Jason Anderson. I barely registered driving to the crash scene. One moment I was in my parents' entryway, gripping my phone with white knuckles, and the next, I was pulling up behind flashing police lights. My pulse was a steady drum of rage, and there he was, my brother, standing next to the wreckage of my brand new car, arms crossed, looking completely unfazed. The front bumper was obliterated, the hood crumpled, and one of the headlights was shattered. My beautiful, perfect car was ruined, and Jason stood there as if it meant nothing. I climbed out of my old beater, slamming the door harder than intended, my hands shaking as I marched toward him. "What the hell did you do?" Jason finally turned to face me, and in the single most infuriating moment of my life, he smirked. "That sucks," he said, shrugging like he'd just dropped my ice cream cone instead of wrecking my car. "But hey, don't freak out. Mom and Dad will make you forgive me." The words hit me like a slap in the face. Mom and Dad would make me forgive him. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an acknowledgement of his actions. It was a smug, arrogant declaration that no matter how angry I was or how much damage he had caused, it wouldn't matter because our parents would smooth it over, just like always. I took a slow, measured breath, fists clenched at my sides, my pulse thundering in my ears. That was the moment something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let him get away with it this time. Not this time. Have you ever had a sibling who thought they could get away with anything? Let me know in the comments, because I was done letting it slide. I woke up the next morning with a pounding headache, my body tense from the sheer frustration of the previous night. My mind replayed every detail of that awful encounter at the crash site, my brother's smirking face haunting me like a nightmare that wouldn't end. My car, my beautiful, hard-earned, brand-new car was gone, destroyed in an instant by someone who had never worked a day in his life, someone who had never faced a single consequence, someone who genuinely believed my anger was just an inconvenience to his day. I knew before stepping out of bed that my parents would be calling, demanding a conversation, trying to smooth things over like they always did, as if Jason's actions were just another minor mistake we could all forget about if I would only be reasonable, like a good daughter should. Sure enough, the moment I checked my phone, I saw 3 missed calls from Mom, 2 from Dad, and a text from Jason that was so breathtakingly arrogant, I had to read it twice to believe my eyes. "Stop being dramatic, Em. It's just a car. Mom and Dad said we'll figure it out, so quit acting like it's the end of the world." There was no apology, no remorse, not even the slightest acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just pure entitlement dripping from every word, as if the real issue wasn't that he had stolen and crashed my property, but that I had dared to make a big deal out of it. I swallowed my anger, forcing myself to breathe slowly, reminding myself that getting upset over a text message wouldn't help me right now. Jason had always been like this, and I knew exactly where he had picked it up. I drove to my parents' house, my knuckles white against the steering wheel of my old backup car, my stomach twisting with a mix of frustration and fatigue, already anticipating how this conversation would unfold. I walked in without knocking, skipping the pleasantries, and found my parents sitting stiffly at the kitchen table, their expressions a blend of forced concern and barely concealed exasperation, as if I were the one creating the problem, as if it was my reaction that needed to be addressed. Jason lounged in one of the chairs, scrolling through his phone, looking entirely unfazed, as if he were just waiting for the storm to pass so he could continue with his life, while I dealt with the aftermath of his actions. Mom sighed heavily, setting down her coffee cup as if she were already drained by my presence, rubbing her temples as though she were the victim in this situation. "Emily, honey, we need to talk about this," she began. "This anger you're holding on to isn't healthy for anyone." I felt something cold settle in my chest, something quiet yet dangerous, a slow-burning fury that I had carried for years but had never fully allowed myself to confront until now. "My anger?" I repeated, my voice unnaturally calm, my hands gripping the back of an empty chair so tightly that my fingers began to ache. "You think my anger is the problem here?" Dad let out a long sigh, exchanging a quick glance with Mom. Their silent communication made it painfully clear that they were united in this, that their decision had been made even before I walked through the door. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with condescension as if I were a child throwing a tantrum over a broken toy. "It's just a car. Jason didn't mean to crash it. and we don't think it's fair to punish him too harshly for something that was clearly an accident. I felt something inside me snap, something that had been held together by sheer willpower for years, something that had been stretched and pulled one too many times. He stole it, I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion, because if I let myself feel anything, I knew I would explode. I told him no. He took my keys anyway. He stole my car, wrecked it, and then smirked in my face because he knew you would cover for him, just like you always do. Jason let out a dramatic sigh, finally looking up from his phone, rolling his eyes as if this entire conversation were beneath him. Jesus, you're acting like I murdered someone, he muttered, shaking his head, his arrogance radiating off him in waves. I made a mistake, okay? Chill out. Mom reached out, placing a gentle hand on mine, her eyes pleading, her expression carefully crafted into something resembling love, but which was really just manipulation in a prettier package. Emily, you're his sister, she said softly, tilting her head as if speaking to a child in need of correction. I know you're upset, but family forgives, sweetheart. That's what we do. We forgive each other.
I stared at her, taken aback by the sheer audacity of her words. She had effortlessly shifted the responsibility onto me to fix what Jason had done, as if my feelings were merely an inconvenience, as if my hard work and sacrifices were insignificant compared to Jason's happiness. In that moment, I realized I had spent my life conditioned to accept this treatment, to believe that my needs always came second, that my anger was unwarranted, and that my pain was something I needed to endure quietly for the sake of family harmony. But I wasn't that person anymore. I refused to let them guilt me into submission this time, so I did something I had never done before. I smiled, just a flicker of amusement, but enough to make my mother pause, and Jason glance at me with a hint of suspicion. "You know what?" I said, my voice light and my expression deceptively calm. I had made up my mind. "You're absolutely right, Mom. Family forgives, and I don't want to hold on to this anger anymore." I watched as relief washed over their faces, and Jason's smirk returned as they all leaned back in their chairs, believing they had won, that they had successfully broken me down into the version of myself they preferred. But they had no idea what I was planning. They didn't realize that, behind my pleasant smile and easy agreement, I was already setting things in motion. I was going to make Jason pay for what he had done. He just didn't know it yet. I had spent my life being told that family comes first, that forgiveness is a virtue, and that holding grudges only leads to bitterness. But as I sat in my car outside the insurance office, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, I realized those rules had only ever applied to me. Jason had never been expected to forgive, compromise, or sacrifice because he had never faced real consequences. Not once in all the years he had coasted through life, on the backs of others cleaning up his messes. But that was about to change, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to be the one left picking up the pieces. When I walked into the insurance office, the air conditioning blasted against my skin, a stark contrast to the fire simmering in my chest, the calculated rage that had fueled me since the moment Jason had sneered at me and claimed our parents would make me forgive him. The woman at the desk barely looked up as she typed into her computer, her voice clipped and professional as she asked how she could help. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before speaking, knowing that once I set this in motion, there would be no turning back. "I need to file a claim for my car," I stated, keeping my tone steady and my expression neutral. The woman nodded, clicking away on her computer before looking back at me. "Was it an accident? Do you have a police report?" "Yes, there's a report," I replied. My pulse remained steady, my decision resolute. "And I need to report it as unauthorized use." This made her pause. She blinked once, tilting her head as if trying to determine whether she had misheard me. "Unauthorized use?" she repeated, her voice carrying a hint of curiosity. "Are you saying your vehicle was stolen?" I could have said yes, but I knew better than to lie outright, especially when the truth was just as damning. "I never gave him permission to take it," I clarified, choosing my words carefully to ensure there was no room for misinterpretation. "I explicitly told him he couldn't drive my car, and he took it anyway." "That's theft, isn't it?" The woman hesitated for a moment before nodding slowly, typing into her system, her gaze focused on the screen as she reviewed company policies on such situations. If you can provide proof that you denied him permission and he took the vehicle regardless, then yes, this qualifies as unauthorized use. I reached into my purse, pulling out my phone, my fingers swiftly locating the text messages from Jason where I had told him no, and where he had laughed it off as if my words meant nothing. I turned the screen toward her, watching as she read through the messages, her eyebrows raising slightly before she nodded again. "This should be sufficient," she said, her voice now purely professional, her fingers moving over the keyboard with precision. "Since you're filing for unauthorized use, the liability will not fall on you. It will transfer to the driver. Jason." The liability would transfer to Jason. The reality of it sank in slowly, like warm honey drizzling over the cold steel of my fury, coating it in something rich and satisfying. Jason, who had spent his entire life escaping responsibility, would finally have to face the consequences of his actions. He had laughed in my face and told me I would have to forgive him. Now he was about to learn what it felt like when the world didn't bend to his will. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, though inside, my heart thudded with an unfamiliar thrill. The woman glanced at her screen, adjusting her glasses before answering. "Well, given the extent of the damage, the estimated total he'll be responsible for is somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000. $30,000 to $40,000. I exhaled slowly, absorbing the number and letting it wash over me like a wave of pure vindication. Jason had never faced anything more than a slap on the wrist. He had never truly dealt with the weight of his actions. But now, that weight was about to come crashing down on him, and I wasn't going to lift a single finger to stop it. By the time I walked out of the office, the sun was shining brighter, the air felt crisper, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt good. I felt powerful. I felt free. Later that night, I sat in my apartment, scrolling through social media, my eyes narrowing as I landed on Jason's latest post. A picture of him and his friends at a bar, drinks in hand, his caption as arrogant as ever. I stared at the screen, reading Jason's latest post. "Tough day, but nothing a few drinks can't fix. Some people need to chill out and move on. Life's too short to stress about little things." Little things, that's what he called it. The sheer audacity of his words sent a ripple of laughter through me, startling me for a moment before I leaned back against the couch, shaking my head in amusement. Jason thought he had won. He believed this was over, that our parents had bailed him out once again, and that everything would return to normal. He thought I had simply swallowed my anger and moved on like I always had before. But what Jason didn't know, what he wouldn't realize until that insurance claim finished processing, was that this time, I wasn't letting it go. This time, Jason was going to learn the hard way. By the time he understood what I had done, it would be too late. Sitting at the dinner table, I could already feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on me, thick and suffocating, as if they had collectively decided tonight would be the night I finally fell back in line. My mother had set the table like it was a holiday gathering, candles flickering in their holders, the smell of roasted chicken and buttery mashed potatoes filling the air. It was her way of making it clear that this was meant to be a family moment, a night of reconciliation, a scene carefully crafted to smooth over what they viewed as an unnecessary conflict. My father sat at the head of the table, his usual commanding yet relaxed presence, his expression giving nothing away. But I knew exactly why we were here, why this meal had been planned so soon after the accident. Jason sat across from me with that insufferable smirk stretched across his face, his phone resting next to his plate, as if he couldn't be bothered to pretend this mattered to him at all. I could feel it coming, the inevitable conversation they had all rehearsed in their heads, the carefully chosen words they would use to convince me that my anger was an inconvenience rather than justified, that my reaction was exaggerated rather than appropriate, that Jason deserved my forgiveness simply because he was family. But as I sat there, my hands resting in my lap, a thick envelope pressed between my fingers beneath the table, I felt nothing but an eerie sense of calm. Unlike them, I already knew how this dinner was going to end. Jason was the first to speak, his voice dripping with the kind of arrogance nurtured since childhood. His words were laced with condescension, and his smirk widened as he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. "So, have you finally calmed down? Or are you still planning to throw a tantrum over a stupid car? The words barely registered, hardly stirring anything inside me, because I had anticipated them, prepared for his attempts to turn this into a joke, and knew he would try to portray me as the unreasonable one in front of our parents. I simply tilted my head, offering him a small, unreadable smile, watching as his confidence grew with what he assumed was my submission. My parents exchanged relieved glances, foolishly believing they had won. My mother let out a dramatic sigh, meant to sound both exasperated and gentle, as if she were playing the role of mediator, as if she were the only one patient enough to deal with me. "Emily, sweetheart, I know this has been a stressful situation for you, but we really need to put this behind us as a family. Jason made a mistake, but holding on to this anger isn't going to fix anything." My father, ever the voice of reason, nodded along as he cut into his chicken, speaking without even looking up. "Life is too short to get caught up in things like this, Emily. At the end of the day, it's just a car. Things can be replaced. Family can't?" I could feel the satisfaction radiating off Jason, practically seeing how he relished my supposed defeat, his ego inflating with every second, his smirk growing more insufferable. He picked up his fork, twirling it between his fingers, shaking his head with mock disappointment. "Seriously, Em, you need to chill. You've always been like this, overreacting, making everything a huge deal. I mean, come on, I crashed a car, not your entire life. You'll get over it." In that moment, as he let out an amused chuckle, my mother reached across the table to place a reassuring hand over mine, and my father nodded approvingly at Jason's words. I finally moved. I reached beneath the table, pulled the envelope into view, and placed it directly in front of Jason with deliberate precision. The sound of thick paper hitting the polished table was loud enough to make all three of them pause. Jason barely spared a glance, his smirk still firmly in place as he shook his head, rolling his eyes as if I was being dramatic, as if whatever I was about to do couldn't possibly be worth his time. "What's this? Some angry letter about how I hurt your feelings?" "Read it," I said simply, my voice even, my expression unreadable. Something in my tone must have caught his attention, because for the first time that night, his amusement wavered, his smirk faltering slightly as he reached for the envelope, fingers hesitating for only a moment before tearing it open. The moment he pulled out the papers, his eyes scanning the words printed across the top, the color drained from his face so quickly that it was almost satisfying to watch, almost poetic in its irony. I remained silent as his hands tightened around the pages, his mouth opening and closing without sound, his entire posture shifting from smug arrogance to dawning horror. My mother frowned, glancing between us in confusion, her hand still resting over mine, her grip tightening slightly. "Emily, what is this?" Jason's voice was barely a whisper, his fingers gripping the document so tightly that the edges crumpled under the pressure. "What did you do?" I took a sip of my wine, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable, just long enough for the weight of reality to settle on Jason's shoulders before I finally spoke, my voice calm, measured, almost gentle. "That, dear brother, is the finalized insurance report." The air shifted instantly, thick with tension, suffocating in its weight. The sudden realization hit my parents like a slap across the face. My father finally looked up from his plate, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth, his eyes sharp and calculating, trying to piece together what had just happened, trying to understand how Jason had gone from untouchable to responsible. My mother pulled her hand away from mine, flipping through the papers with growing panic, her breath hitching as she processed what this meant, reading the numbers printed clearly in bold ink. Jason, for the first time in his life, looked afraid. I had never felt more satisfied in my entire existence. Jason's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he pushed back from the table with enough force to rattle the silverware. His breath came in sharp, uneven bursts, his face twisted in disbelief and fury, his hands gripping the insurance papers so tightly that they crumpled under his fingers. He stood there for a moment, his chest rising and falling as he stared at me with something that looked almost like betrayal, as if I had somehow wronged him by refusing to roll over and accept what he had done. It was as if the real crime here was not his recklessness, not his entitlement, not his theft, but my audacity in making him face the consequences of his actions. His voice was tight when he finally spoke, low and furious, shaking with barely contained rage. "This isn't funny, Emily. Tell me you're joking." I didn't respond right away. allowing the silence to stretch between us as I observed the panic flicker across Jason's face. He glanced between me and our parents, seemingly hoping they would intervene and resolve this before it spiraled out of control. My mother's lips parted slightly, her fingers clutching the fabric of her blouse, her eyes darting over the papers in front of her, as if searching for a loophole or some way to make this all disappear. My father, ever composed, took a deep breath and placed his hands flat against the table. His voice was measured and calm, but there was an undercurrent of frustration. "Emily," he said, his gaze sharp and heavy with expectation, the way it always was when he wanted me to yield. "This is going too far. You're punishing your brother in a way that isn't just cruel, it's vindictive." Jason let out a bitter laugh, hollow and forced, running his fingers through his hair as he turned away from the table, pacing like a caged animal, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is insane. You're actually trying to ruin my life over a goddamn car." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest, my expression unreadable and my voice steady. "No, Jason, I'm not ruining your life. I'm just not cleaning up your mess this time." My mother inhaled sharply, her hand flying to her chest as if I had struck her, her eyes wide with disbelief. She couldn't comprehend that I was refusing to play the role she had assigned me since childhood. The responsible one who forgave, smoothed things over, and made sacrifices so Jason never had to. "Sweetheart, this is going to follow him for years," she whispered, her voice trembling, her fingers tightening around the papers, as if she could will them out of existence. "Insurance claims like this, the financial burden. This isn't just a small punishment. This is going to ruin his credit, his future, his ability to—" "Do what, Mom?" I interrupted, my voice sharper now, my patience wearing thin as my hands pressed against the edge of the table. "To keep coasting through life without consequences? To keep taking whatever he wants without worrying about how it affects other people? To keep letting you and Dad protect him from reality?" Jason slammed his hands against the back of his chair, his jaw clenched, his entire body wound so tight I thought he might snap. "You're seriously acting like I killed someone," he snarled, eyes blazing with rage, his voice trembling with disbelief. "I made a mistake, okay? I took your car, I wrecked it, I was an asshole about it. Fine, I get it, I screwed up, but you—" He gestured wildly at the papers in my mother's hands, his expression twisted in frustration. "You went out of your way to make this as bad as possible for me." Something inside me flared at those words, something raw and furious, something that had been simmering for years, but had never fully surfaced until now. I rose to my feet slowly, deliberately, my gaze locking onto Jason's. My voice was low but unshakable, my anger cold and precise. "You didn't care when I lost something I worked for. Why should I care now that you're losing something?" The words hit him harder than I anticipated, knocking the breath from his lungs. His expression faltered momentarily, a flicker of something like regret flashing across his face, but it vanished just as quickly, buried beneath layers of entitlement and anger, the unwavering belief that I was the unfair one. My father exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temples as if this were an exhausting inconvenience, as if my refusal to cave was simply an irritation. "Emily, I understand that you're upset, but this isn't right. We're family. We don't do this to each other." I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head, my arms crossing over my chest. "We don't do this to each other?" I replied, incredulous. "That's funny, Dad, because Jason had no problem doing it to me." "And you had no problem letting him," Jason scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief, his hands gripping his hair as if he might tear it out. "I don't have that kind of money," he muttered, his voice cracking slightly as the reality of the situation sank in. "How the hell am I supposed to pay for this?" For the first time that night, I actually smiled, but there was nothing warm or soft about it. "Figure it out," I said simply, turning my back on him and walking toward the door, refusing to look back, denying him the satisfaction of seeing even a hint of doubt in my expression. I heard my mother call after me, her voice high with desperation, pleading for me to think this through, to be reasonable, to not let this tear the family apart. But I didn't stop, didn't turn, didn't hesitate. Jason had taken something from me, and for the first time in his life, he was going to give something back, whether he liked it or not. Days passed, but Jason didn't call, didn't text, didn't try to reach out. Honestly, I wasn't surprised in the slightest. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was scrambling, panicking, trying to find a way out of the mess he had created, desperately hoping that someone, somewhere, would bail him out as they always had before. I could picture him pacing in his overpriced apartment, running his hands through his hair, calling our parents every hour to demand they fix this, just like they had fixed everything else for him in the past. Never once stopping to consider that maybe, just maybe, this was a problem too big for them to sweep under the rug. I understood my parents had money, but I also knew they weren't wealthy enough to make $40,000 vanish without significant sacrifices. They would have to dip into funds meant for their own security, shaking the foundation of their comfortable lives in a way that would make them profoundly uncomfortable. If there was one thing I knew for certain, it was that my parents despised being uncomfortable. The first time Jason finally showed up at my apartment, I didn't even need to check the peephole to know it was him. The aggressive pounding on my door, the impatient huff of breath on the other side, and the sheer entitlement practically radiating through the wood confirmed it all. I took my time answering, letting him stew in silence, stretching it long enough to make him wonder if I would even acknowledge him at all. I wanted him to feel just a fraction of the frustration and helplessness I had felt when he had stolen my car and wrecked it without a second thought. When I finally opened the door, I found him looking disheveled, the dark circles under his eyes more pronounced than usual. His normally cocky posture was slightly hunched, and his fingers twitched at his sides, like he was barely holding himself together. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over my chest, maintaining a carefully neutral expression as I arched an eyebrow. "Something wrong, Jason?" I asked, his jaw clenched at my words, his eyes flashing with something dark and dangerous, a last-ditch attempt at control. "You need to undo this," he said, his voice low and tight, barely restrained. "I don't care what it takes, just make this go away." I let out a quiet breath through my nose, shaking my head slightly. My expression remained unchanged, my patience non-existent. "It's done," I replied simply, my voice steady and calm. "You'd need a lawyer and about 30 grand to fight it, and we both know you don't have either of those." For a split second, I saw something in his face crack, a tiny fracture in the carefully constructed mask of confidence he had worn for his entire life. A flicker of pure, unfiltered panic crossed his features, but just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by anger and resentment. He let out a sharp, bitter laugh, running both hands through his hair before dropping them to his sides, his shoulders tense and breathing uneven. "You seriously hate me this much?" he demanded, his voice rising as his composure slipped. "You think I deserve to have my entire life destroyed over a fucking car?" I tilted my head slightly, watching him with something close to amusement, cold, detached, and utterly devoid of sympathy. "You destroyed my car without a second thought, Jason. Why should I care that I'm destroying your bank account?" His hands curled into fists at his sides, nostrils flaring, his entire body shaking with barely contained rage, his voice breaking under the weight of his own desperation. "This isn't fair, Emily. You're punishing me for something that was never meant to be this serious, something that wasn't supposed to ruin me. I made a mistake, okay? A stupid mistake. But what you're doing is cruel, calculated, and insane." I felt my lips twitch. Not quite a smile, but a small, satisfied acknowledgement of the irony of the moment. Jason was finally experiencing something he had never considered before: accountability. "You'll figure it out," I said simply, shifting my weight onto one foot, my voice light and almost dismissive. "That's what you always do, right?" For the first time in his life, Jason had nothing to say. I started to close the door, but before I could, his phone buzzed in his pocket. I saw his face shift into something that resembled fear as he fumbled to pull it out, his eyes scanning the screen with confusion and dread. I leaned casually against the doorframe, watching as his expression darkened, his jaw tightening. His fingers gripped the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "What's wrong, Jason?" I asked, my voice dripping with false innocence, my eyes never leaving his face. His mouth opened slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out, just a sharp, uneven breath. It was the sound of his world crumbling around him. In that moment, I knew he had finally received the message I had been waiting for, the one from his employer, informing him that his reckless behavior had raised concerns, The one explaining that his recent promotion was now being reevaluated, the one making it clear that his Golden Boy immunity was officially over. For the first time in his life, Jason was well and truly alone. I didn't wait for him to look up at me, didn't wait to see the full extent of his realization, and didn't wait to hear whatever pathetic excuse or desperate plea was bound to spill from his lips. I simply smiled, a slow, knowing, satisfied smile, and gently shut the door in his face.